Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I would like to remind you that this conference is being recorded. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. For those connected by telephone requiring operator assistance during the call, please press *0. Web participants requiring support should use the chat feature on your screen. I would now like to turn the meeting over to your moderator today, Angela Morin, Patient Partner Lead for Patient and Family-Centered Care. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar entitled How to Engage and Support Diverse Patient Partnerships During a Crisis. For the purposes of this webinar, I am using the term patient to be inclusive of residents, clients, families, and caregivers. Isabel, I'm going to have you advance the slides for me today. Thank you. Patient engagement and partnership efforts often focus on those that have the capacity, willingness, and ability to engage. In times of crisis, this is often exacerbated with many organizations going to those most familiar to them. However, these patient engagement efforts do not necessarily reflect the range of patient populations that use or need healthcare in Canada, including those from ethnocultural backgrounds who do not speak English or French, in lower socioeconomic backgrounds, underhoused or underserved populations. My name is Angela Morin. I am a patient partner and lead for Patient and Family-Centered Care at Kingston Health Science Centre, and I'm happy to be moderating today's session with Alison Koyman, co-chair for Patient Safety Canada. I also want to welcome today's presenter, Carolyn Shimon, Patient and Engagement Lead at Georgette and Fahey Center for Healthcare Innovation. This is part 2 of a 2-part webinar that will unpack a variety of considerations for engagement with diverse patient populations. We will explore the added challenges brought about by COVID-19 and specific ways we can do better now and after the pandemic. Thank you all for taking a moment to fill out the lobby pool. As we begin this discussion, it's interesting to see your level of familiarity with today's important topic. I think there's lots that we can all be learning. During our webinar, we will be learning from folks who work in this space and working to unpack how COVID-19 has impacted challenges in supporting these partnerships. And we will be very interested in hearing from all of you, your questions, your reflections, and your lessons learned. Just a reminder to folks that this topic might be difficult for some people or feel kind of heavy, so sometimes that can take us a little off guard. Please take breaks if needed. Do what you need to support and care for yourself. Thank you for joining us from wherever you are across this country. Although I do still spend some days actually on site at Kingston Health Science Centre, like many of you over the last few months, there's been some significant impact on my day-to-day. So today, I am so thankful to be joining with you from my home office on Wolfe Island, the largest of the beautiful Thousand Islands. Wolfe Island sits at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River between Cape Vincent, New York and Kingston, Ontario, on the traditional and unceded territory of the Onondaga, Haudenosaunee, and Huron-Wendat. I would also like to acknowledge the talented CFHI broadcast team we are working with from their home offices as well, which are located on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation, which is where the CFHI office is located. We are pleased to be offering this discussion series, including today's webinar, bilingually. The telephone number to connect to the French audio can be found on the screen, and we invite you to use either official language when entering your questions and comments in the chat box. As a reminder, we are also recording this session, which will be archived on our website. It will be available on the website within the week. The main purpose of these discussions are for all of us to share and to learn together, having a place to discuss relevant and topical issues of patient and family engagement during this evolving pandemic, and to be able to include and welcome multiple perspectives of those involved in patient engagement across Canada, those working within organizations and healthcare systems and patient partners who have been involved in healthcare system improvement to gain insights into innovative engagement practices as well as where challenges remain. For those of you who have joined before, you will know that the chat box is the prime mode of conversation and that the chat box moves quickly. We will do our best to raise comments from the chat box throughout today's session, but please be assured that we capture all of the comments in the chat box and will provide a summary of the conversation that will be shared on our website the following week. As noted earlier, these discussion sessions are recorded and the link will be available for you to listen or view again should you like. What we share helps all of us to better understand the rapidly changing landscape of patient engagement across the country during this time of pandemic, and importantly, to consider ways that we may strengthen engagement and partnership and respond to emerging challenges. During today's webinar, we will explore and understand the difference between trauma-informed care and trauma-informed engagement. Isabel, can you advance the slide, please? Thank you. Understand why trauma-informed engagement approaches are important from a patient partner and lived experience perspective. Understand how trauma-informed engagement approaches may be utilized, and understand the importance of and what it means to bear witness and to uphold space for stories to be heard and valued. Understanding the importance of trauma-informed engagement has never been more important than it is now in this time of crisis. We do recognize that this is the beginning of a conversation, that there are many voices and stories that need to inform this work, and many of those people will not be on a webinar or at a table in a meeting room. I am truly grateful for those of you who are here today, to our guests for sharing their lessons learned, and for all of you for joining us in this discussion. I began as a patient experience advisor in 2010 at what was then Kingston General Hospital and is now Kingston Health Science Center. I became a patient and family experience advisor like many advisors and patient partners do after experiencing the healthcare system in a very personal way with a close friend, going through her cancer journey and end-of-life care. I've had the opportunity to share my experiences in many ways, in many places, and to many audiences. I have always done this in partnership with others, and now in my role as lead for patient and family-centered care, I continue to try to do that by providing the space, support, and resources for others to share their experiences. And I continue to learn every day from the many patient partners that I am privileged to know. I have shared my own surgical patient experience in a feedback forum with staff and leaders to identify opportunities for improvement. I have been a team member on working groups and sat on patient and family advisory councils and committees. I know what it feels like to be at tables where you do not think your perspective is valued, but more often I have been blessed with being at tables where I am welcomed, encouraged, and supported for my perspective. I've stood in front of large and small audiences in person and virtually sharing experiences. I have found myself frozen on the verge of tears on a stage after locking eyes with someone in the audience who had clearly had a similar experience and was sitting with tears streaming down her face listening to my story. There are stories about my mom's cancer journey that years later I am still unable to tell unless I am prepared to feel the welling up of emotion in my chest and believe that those listening will understand why I am telling them this deeply personal story and that they will be motivated to want to do something to make it better for others. As we look to the future of engagement and think about how we can engage more diverse perspectives, how we can ensure that the voices of those we most need to hear are being heard, as we think about how to learn lessons from experiences of patients and families who have experienced trauma during COVID-19, we need to be thinking about how do we do this safely, respectfully, and purposefully. we need to be thinking about how to engage differently. We need to look for creative ways to hear and be responsive to the experiences of those who are most vulnerable and who need us the most. And we need to be rebuilding trust in a system that stopped engaging with their patient partners when times got tough. We need to rebuild trust in a system that locked families, partners in care out of the building when they needed to be there the most. Today's conversation is so important in thinking about where do we go from here in building inclusive and meaningful engagement practices. For all of us to learn how we can, together, ensure that those who are generous enough and passionate enough and fearless enough to share their experiences of the healthcare system come away from every interaction feeling like the pain of opening the wound is worth the healing it may bring to themselves and to the future of healthcare. I look forward to learning with all of you today about how trauma-informed engagement will help us to do that. As I mentioned, I am joined today by Allison Koyman. Injured as a result of a cancer misdiagnosis, Allison speaks with first-hand experience about the harm after harm that results when responses to patient safety incidents are less than ideal. Allison is a former licensed practical nurse, co-chair for Patients for Patient Safety Canada, and a current master's student at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan campus. Welcome, and over to you, Allison.
Thank you for the introduction, Angela. Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me okay. As Angela mentioned, my name is Allison Koyman, and I'm joining you this morning from Coldstream, British Columbia, which is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Silk Nation. I've been asked for some personal reflections on this topic of trauma-informed patient engagement from the vantage point of the patient partner. So I want to start off by saying that I am so glad to see that there is work being done in this area as a necessary consideration for engaging patients, as well as we all continue to figure out this work in patient engagement and as this space continues to evolve. I really think that the essence of this topic is how harm can happen again through engagement with patients and how important it is to have this on your radar. What has been acknowledged is the need for patients to be involved in healthcare improvement processes and decision-making. What is less clear is how we go about effectively and safely doing that. But I think, as Angela pointed out as well, it's important to note that most often patients enter into the space of patient engagement following some sort of concerning or traumatic experience or set experiences. They most often engage because they have a desire to participate in meaningful system changes and wish to have their voices and experiences heard, with the intention to ensure that these adverse experiences do not happen to the next person. We see ourselves as contributors to finding solutions to the wicked problems that plague our healthcare system. In my own personal context, experiencing harm in the provision of healthcare services, I enter this space with the hopes that my contributions may prevent someone else from enduring similar harm to my own. This is the essence of my efforts and the force that drives me. And I'm the first to acknowledge my own trauma and to see it in my peer patient partners who also navigate this space. We have a lot of conversations about how easy it is for our stories, our personal, visceral, intimate, and vulnerable experiences to be used or co-opted in ways which we may not have intended or given permission. And as a result, many of us have stopped sharing. Many of us are burnt out. Many of us are frustrated. When I reflect on how patients can be harmed in the engagement process, my mind goes to the nature of healthcare organizations who tend to have a rigid structural composition, which may not facilitate the flexibility that is required to do patient engagement well. Sometimes organizational processes themselves are harmful to patient partners, and I would suggest that this is particularly the case with our Indigenous partners. Patient engagement, to me, is a trade-off and somewhat of a negotiation. I will help you find solutions that matter to patients by offering up my own vulnerability and experience, but I have an expectation. I expect that I will be an authentic member of the team. I expect that I will have a safe place to share my thoughts and experiences. And I expect that I will be provided with some sort of recognition for my efforts. But I also expect that if I share my hurt and my pain, that it won't be dismissed and that there is a duty to act. There is a call to action. Many of us patients are very sensitive to the fact that often our stories are used as quote-unquote inspiration porn and simply left at that. And this is not why we're here. Further to this, I note that there is a clear top-down movement to manage expectations of patients involved in engagement processes. There are often very clear parameters to determine how we are engaged and what we are allowed to contribute. For me personally, being the owner of a story that is upsetting, I have really struggled to find spaces where people were ready and willing to listen, much less actually act. What I would really like to see is a movement towards a more relational approach to patient engagement, cultivating a mindful approach to sustaining quality and balanced relationships. This, in my opinion, is part of a trauma-informed process. So to sum things up, yes, patient engagement has the potential to be harmful to patient partners, but it also has the potential to produce the opposite effect, to heal if it is done well and carefully. So I'll now take this opportunity to introduce today's presenter, Carolyn Shimon. Carolyn is the Patient and Public Engagement Lead at the George and Fahey Center for Healthcare Innovation, Manitoba's 4 support units. In this role, she is responsible for all patient public engagement and health research programs and services offered at the center, including their Patient Engagement Lunchtime Learning Series, the PE Champions Program, the Funding Award to support patient public engagement and health research, and the CHI Patient Engagement Collaborative Partnership. Carolyn has a bachelor's degree, combined honors in journalism and political science, and a master's degree in gender studies. And she is a big proponent of using a social justice and health equity lens in patient and public engagement. And she writes and speaks about the importance of incorporating a trauma-informed intersectional analysis in order to build truly inclusive and safe spaces with patients and public engagement in health research. So I'll turn it over to you, Carolyn.
Thank you so much, Allison. And thank you both, Angela and Allison, for sharing your thoughts and your personal reflections today around, and I think it really emphasizes the importance of making sure that when we do patient engagement, whether in healthcare systems or in health research decision making, that it's trauma informed. Thank you for the introduction and for inviting me here today. I'm here to talk just a little bit about trauma-informed engagement of people, families, and communities who have had lived experiences of health issues. I'd like to start off by acknowledging that I'm coming to you today from Winnipeg, Manitoba, so from Treaty 1 land, home of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and homeland of the Métis Nation. And so in coming together today, respecting treaties that were made on the territories, acknowledging harms and mistakes, but also recognizing the ongoing present-day colonial violence that is faced by Indigenous peoples within healthcare, education, justice, child welfare, and government systems. And when we're talking about patient engagement, I really want to emphasize that it has to be rooted in social justice. Trauma-informed engagement is a piece of that puzzle, and in order to really achieve true systemic change and health equity. I personally work in the realm of patient and public engagement and health research decision-making, but I think a lot of what we've learned over the years and understand around trauma-informed engagement can also be applied to healthcare systems decision-making. And I think I would agree, Angela, how you mentioned the timeliness of today's discussion. It can't be overstated where with the pandemic, there's almost been a kind of creation of a collective trauma that involves grief and loss. And there's also a layering with continued conversations around social justice and the need to address trauma experienced through systemic racism within our society as well. And so the timeliness is really, really important right now in discussing these things. So I wanted to start off, here's just a little overview of what we'll briefly touch on. First of all, what is trauma? Why is it important to address when we're talking about patient engagement? The differences between being uncomfortable and being unsafe, the importance of bearing witness, and then we're going to look at a framework that we worked on here at CHI that uses a trauma-informed and intersectional lens, and then a little bit about self-care, because I think that's an important part of the puzzle as well. So maybe if we can switch the slide. Thank you so much. So first of all, let's look at what is trauma. And trauma is defined as one or more experiences that overwhelm an individual's capacity to cope. And we need to really recognize that it's a widespread, harmful, and costly public health issue, as Allison was noting in her talk. And yet, oftentimes, I think when we develop engagement strategies, we overlook the fact that some of the experiential knowledge that we're asking people to share with us to help inform health systems decision-making may also be intertwined with some experiences of trauma. And we know for a fact that evidence has shown that people in primary care settings may have significant trauma histories that can have an effect not only on a person's physical and mental health, but also their responsiveness to health interventions and their ability to access appropriate health care services, and hence to even identify as a patient. So it's important to make sure that any engagement strategy that we're thinking about from the very, very beginning, from identifying who should be involved to choosing the right participatory approaches, has a trauma-informed lens. On top of this, something that I think both Angela and Allison really eloquently laid out was that there needs to be an understanding that healthcare systems themselves that are intended to provide services and supports to individuals may be trauma-inducing. For example, the use of coercive practices such as seclusion or restraints in the behavioral health system, or the use of invasive procedures in the medical health system can be re-traumatizing to individuals who may have already experienced significant histories of trauma before even entering the system. So trauma-informed practice really begins with building an awareness amongst everyone who's involved in the partnership, whether you're a healthcare decision maker, a health researcher, somebody who does patient engagement, or patient and public partners. There's building that awareness that trauma is a common experience, that it impacts our central ability, our development, that it has there's a wide range of adaptations that people make in order to cope and survive trauma, and there's a relationship between trauma and physical and mental health. And trauma can be experienced early in life, such as child abuse, physical, emotional, psychological, and sexual, or neglect, witnessing violence, and disrupted attachment. Trauma can also occur later in life through experiences such as violence, accidents, natural disasters, war, sudden unexpected loss, and other life events that are out of one's control. And the intricacies can't be overstated because there's a lot of different dimensions to trauma. It includes the magnitude, the complexity, the frequency, the duration, at what age trauma occurred, and whether it happens from an interpersonal source or an external source. There's 5 types of trauma that we usually think about. And that's, first of all, single incident trauma. So that's when something unexpected or overwhelming, an event occurs, an accident, a natural disaster, a single episode of abuse or assault, a sudden loss, or witnessing violence. And when we think about the healthcare system, an example of this might be women who experience pregnancy loss may struggle with some really profound trauma responses. And then there's complex or repetitive trauma, and this is when abuse may be ongoing, such as domestic violence, war, or ongoing betrayal, and it's often kind of involves feeling trapped both emotionally and physically. Again, an example within the healthcare system, we know that there's some recent evidence around survivors of childhood cancer later on in adulthood struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder. So these are kind of examples around that. There's developmental trauma, so that results from exposure to early and ongoing or repetitive trauma as a child, neglect, abandonment, abuse or assault, witnessing violence or death, or coercion or betrayal. And these types of trauma really often occur with a child's caregiving sphere, and that interferes with healthy attachment and development. Then there's intergenerational trauma, and this describes the psychological or emotional effects that can be experienced by people who live with trauma survivors. So what's often seen as coping or adaptation patterns developed in response to trauma can be passed from one generation to the next. And then there's historical trauma, and that's this last one. And it's kind of a cumulative emotional or psychological wounding over a lifetime and across generations, emanating from massive group trauma. And these collective traumas are inflicted by oppressive and dominant systems of power. And so examples of historical trauma would include genocide, colonialism, slavery, and war. Oftentimes when we're engaging refugee communities and so on, having an understanding of those types of historical traumas. But also in Canada, it's really important for trauma-informed engagement to include an examination of the role of colonization, both past and present, in violence against Indigenous peoples. And this includes the consideration around the legacy of the residential schooling system, where from the 1800s until 1996, approximately 150,000 First Nation, Inuit, and Métis children were removed from their families and communities by the government and forced to attend residential schools where people were subjected to physical, spiritual, emotional, psychological, and sexual abuse. Additionally, the 60s scoop as well, involving thousands of Indigenous children being taken away from their families. And also the ongoing overrepresentation of Indigenous children in child welfare systems. It's an urgent and ongoing challenge facing Indigenous communities across Canada. So it's important to note that intergenerational trauma and historical trauma, there are some overlaps in those things. And we know the effects of trauma, that it can vary from person to person, whether it's minor disruptions in an individual's life to debilitating responses, and people may experience everything from anxiety, terror, shock, shame, emotional numbness, disconnection, intrusive thoughts, helplessness, and powerlessness. And all of these responses can interfere with an individual's sense of safety, of self, and self-efficacy, as well as the ability to regulate emotions and navigate relationships. And coping or adaptation skills that people develop in response to trauma and perceived ongoing threats can produce things like difficulty controlling or regulating emotional reactions or behavior, so either appearing to overreact to something, or else the opposite, listlessness, where an individual seems numb or disconnected. And it has many different physical health implications as well, as trauma survivors can experience chronic pain, asthma, heart palpitations, gastrointestinal problems, all of these different things. And the pervasiveness and harmful impact of traumatic events on individuals and families and caregivers and communities, and the unintended but similarly widespread re-traumatization of individuals within public institutions and service systems, not only healthcare but also education, corrections, child welfare, government interactions, make it necessary for all people doing engagement and patient partners to have an understanding of these impacts and of trauma. Maybe if we could switch slides. And traumatic events, by their very nature, set up kind of a power differential between one entity, whether it's an individual, an event, a system, or a force of nature, having power over another. So an individual's experiences of these events or circumstances are shaped in the context of this powerlessness and feelings of humiliation or guilt or shame, betrayal, or silencing, and that often shapes the experience of the event. And so it's important with interpersonal interactions, which are at the core of patient and public engagement, that these feelings of powerless are not being reproduced or reconstituted in any way. And patient partners come to engagement with a variety of life experiences that shape how they feel, what they think, how they respond when interacting with members of healthcare decision makers or healthcare professionals and clinicians and engagement professionals. And so people may have already experienced boundary violations and abuses of power, including interpersonal trauma, such as domestic violence or childhood violence, or other forms of oppression and violence within the healthcare system. So facing systemic racism, transphobia, ableism. So it's really important to recognize these amongst the entire team and the partnership, recognizing these types of feelings and being able to understand how to balance power and how to renegotiate it within the team so that everyone is starting to feel, that everyone feels safe when coming together. If we can switch slides. So when we start talking about trauma-informed engagement, one of the pieces of the puzzle, and I think we have these questions later on that we'll talk about, is whenever groups get together, and if it's going to be a long-term partnership, oftentimes what we do is start with an exercise around physical, emotional, psychological, and cultural safety, because they're integral aspects of trauma-informed engagement. And so it's important to understand that people who have experienced and survived trauma may feel unsafe in new environments and have difficulty trusting people within the healthcare system and their intentions. Healthcare decision makers need to realize that a patient or public partner's reactions are not necessarily personal and don't necessarily reflect their skills or abilities, but in fact it could be a reaction because you represent the healthcare system, and these reactions may be influenced by what has come before or expectations of what is to come next, including the fear of being let down again by the healthcare system. So I guess what we're talking about is recognizing the difference between unsafe and uncomfortable. And that's an important piece, and that safe spaces doesn't always mean that you're going to be comfortable to express yourself and not be judged, because if you do say something that harms someone else, you're going to get called on it. If you say something that's considered racist or sexist or homophobic or transphobic, you're going to be challenged on it. Or ableist, sanist, sizist, ageist, or classist, we're gonna talk about it because, and this might feel uncomfortable, but that doesn't mean it's unsafe. And so what it looks like in public and patient engagement and healthcare systems decision making, it could be a patient partner challenging a healthcare decision maker about their program or their service, not addressing issues of importance to people of color, Indigenous people who are facing additional barriers. And so calling them out and saying that there is a privileged perspective here that's kind of informing the development of the program and that they need to address these other aspects. It might also look like a patient partner being challenged on their experiential knowledge as representative of a perspective of white privilege. So where there's experience, where their experience does not necessarily include the same systemic barriers such as racism or ableism or colonialism that other to healthcare, that some of these barriers to healthcare access that other people face. And in both instances, the healthcare decision maker or the patient partner who's being called out may have truly come with the best of intentions and wants to change the system, but somewhere along the way, some words or some behavior has impacted someone else in the group in a way that's harmful, and so there has to be a challenge to that and a conversation. And dealing with that discomfort, so being confronted with that, that we've caused harms, the initial reaction might be to get angry or cry or leave the room and say that we don't feel safe. But the reality is we feel really uncomfortable. These reactions are just kind of defensive moves to get us out of feeling uncomfortable. So safe spaces means starting to look at and lean into this kind of uncomfortableness. So first of all, centering yourself. It's important to remember that you're not being personally attacked, that it's about something you said, your behavior, and trying to stop harm to other people in the group. And the second step is listening. So don't interrupt people or think of ways to defend yourself. Focus on learning. What was the harmful thing that I said, and being empathetic and compassionate. And as one of our patient partners always says, you have 2 eyes and 2 ears and only 1 mouth for a reason. So doing that is important. And then it's time to acknowledge and apologize. So instead of trying to explain why you said something, just acknowledging what happened and apologizing, and if needed or requested, for the harm you caused. And then as a person who's called you out consents and has the time or the resources, you can ask what you could be doing differently and how to make amends for what happened. And if they do not consent or have the time or resources, it's up to you to go and learn more about whether it's anti-oppressive practice or anti-racist practice, and come back. And then, as the saying goes, the best apology is changed behavior. So if the person or people who have confronted you have given you recommendations and amends, do them. Don't do the harm again, and using this experience to help others learn. And sometimes it's going to be uncomfortable, but it's really important to have those conversations and not to move away from them by sometimes misusing the language of safety versus comfort. So assuming that your comfort zone is the same thing as your safety zone is a mindset that can really impede from truly inclusive engagement. And sometimes the safest thing is to be uncomfortable and examine why this is so. So instead of trying to resist that feeling, leaning into it, learning and growing is really important for the entire group, and feeling safe enough to have those conversations. And I think what Angela was saying was really important. First and foremost, it's about building actual relationships. I know sometimes in healthcare systems work and research, there's this desire to move right into this agenda quickly and ask for co-development of terms of reference or consensus building engagement opportunities around a decision. But taking the time to slow down and get to know all of the partners who make up your team, allowing flexibility, adaptability in order to ensure space for storytelling and laughter is essential. And this may mean, and I know now in the online environment, a lot of it means having, meetings that are completely dedicated to how are you doing? What are you doing to keep yourself, healthy during this time? What kind of things are making you happy? So it's really important to have those conversations. Also, adapting spaces to make sure that they're not re-traumatizing for patient partners, so understanding that having meetings in hospital settings might not be the best, but also I know now with online engagement, sometimes people feel more comfortable having landline conversations and those things as well. And discussing, having one-on-ones with everyone and discussing what's going to help them, whether it means sitting in a circle or removing hierarchy, dimming lights, allowing space to move around. These things are really important. And then providing everyone, one of the biggest empowering things is providing clear and accessible information to people. and making sure that everyone understands where we're at, and also meeting people where they're at rather than forcing. I think, Allison, you really put this out there, rather than forcing patient partners to conform to settings that they may not easily navigate. It might be engaging community. Say if you're engaging youth around outcomes that are really important to them with a healthcare systems program. It might be utilizing a participatory approach like going out and taking photographs and having those types of things. So different ways of engaging that meets people where they're at versus kind of forcing them. Ensuring confidentiality. We always like to say things like, things we learn together can be shared. Stories we tell one another must stay here. So this means general information about healthcare systems or research processes can be shared outside of the group, but the experiential knowledge and the stories that we share amongst ourselves stay within the group. Also, creating a crisis plan is really important. So no matter what you're engaging people on, it's important to already have some supports and lists of supports and resources available on hand ahead of time. Supports that can easily be accessible to people within the community, free walk-in, in-person phone and online supports. You can offer to sit with a partner if they want some support when they're phoning to make an appointment or reaching out to a crisis line. And it's also important to have an understanding of things like grounding techniques, which help someone, say, if they're saying something and they're getting into some trauma reactions, thinking about how to manage overwhelming feelings, whether it's to leave the room and take some deep breaths, sipping a glass of water slowly, or focusing on an object in front of them. And then demonstrating predictable expectations, schedule meetings consistently. In building trusting relationships and establishing safe spaces, it's really important that patient partners are able to set the tone and set the pace of the meetings, and modeling very consistent behaviors so that there's a feeling of kind of ongoing reliability and support. So sometimes even during this period of time where projects have perhaps stopped, it's really important to still connect with partners to see how they're doing and what's going on in their lives. Even if there's nothing to really engage people on, it's important to keep that relationship going. It's also important to understand issues around, bearing witness. I think do you think we could switch the slides? Sorry, I wasn't. There we go. The importance of bearing witness is a big thing as well. And it's something that we don't necessarily always think about. This quote is actually a quote that I love, and everyone who knows me, I usually include it. It's by Judith Butler, and I have it posted on my office wall as kind of a reminder that as human beings, we're all complex, and at the heart of it, quite messy at times, and we don't always stay intact, and despite our best efforts, we may at some point of time come undone. A tremendous loss may occur, a loss of a loved one, of a home, of employment, or a sense of self. The experience of illness itself can shake our very core of our understanding and relationship with our bodies and our minds and our spirits. And physical, emotional, verbal, and sexual violence, all of these things can create lasting effects that may remain imprinted on our bodies, our psyches, and our souls. And trauma can create for an individual a deep sense of loss, a loss of control over one's body, one's thoughts, one's word, and can create that sense of powerlessness and loss of agency and of self. And so we feel sometimes that we've come undone. And it's important that we understand that people may respond to this undoing in a variety of ways in order to cope. And when we do engagement, there's an aspiration to open up spaces for people to have their stories heard, to have their pain acknowledged, to have their experiential knowledge really illuminate new ways of doing healthcare systems work. And the foundation of engagement is built upon partners' ability to share their experiential knowledge, but we don't talk about bearing witness sometimes when we think about it. And bearing witness just means the sharing of experiences with others, most notably the communication of traumatic events. And so creating a safe space for engagement means that patient and public partners may want to share their experiences not only to help inform healthcare systems decision-making, but for other reasons as well, right? Using it as a valuable way to process their experience, obtaining empathy and support from the team, lightening their emotional load via sharing it with a witness, or asserting their own agency as well. And so to act as a witness to a patient's story is largely a nonverbal act. It's about being a compassionate observer, giving our attention to others without judgment, and providing a space for partners to really speak their truth. And oftentimes we feel like we're ill-prepared to do this, but it's good to remind ourselves that many of us bear witness on a daily basis through our interactions with others, whether by way of conversation or writing or art. And we're all witnesses for one another, whether we choose to be or not. But in engagement, the act of bearing witness is really formalized by the rules and expectations placed on everyone. So members can play a supportive role by powerfully upholding partners' right to take up space and have their story heard. It's not about affixing partners' pain or sharing that we've had similar experience. It's about showing up, being present, and letting partners know that they're not alone and that they are being seen and heard, and that their experiences matter not only to other members of the team, but also to the healthcare system's decision making. And so bearing witness requires active and reflective listening skills so that people feel heard. This means listening for the meaning of what they believe they've heard, what you've heard, or offer back a statement like, let me know, make sure I understand what you've told, or what did I miss, if anything. And I think it's also kind of the strengths-based piece of the puzzle too, acknowledging people's effort and people's strengths, offering appreciation and understanding, and recognizing success. So those are really important as time goes on. And then I think maybe I'll skip a little piece right now because I know we're running out of time. But if we can flip to the next slide. Excellent. So this is the Valuing All Voices framework that we did, and we engage people across Manitoba who traditionally are voices less heard in healthcare research and engagement. And we came up with these 5 components. And the interesting thing when we talk about trauma-informed engagement is a lot of what like a lot of these things were kind of reflected back when we talked about it with people. And the goal of the framework is to provide the context for partnership with teams to conduct engagement through the use of social justice and health equity and to improve safety. And it was really interesting. People really talked about the need for strengths-based methods, so centering on resiliency, allowing time to build strength, assuming best intentions when someone might appear to be having a difficult time or challenge, understanding the impact of systemic barriers and acknowledging privilege and bias, acknowledging the courage and strength that it takes to be vulnerable with people, and addressing power imbalances by supporting resistance and renegotiation of power. And one of my favorites from partners was recognizing that we're all works in progress on journeys of health or recovery, and understanding where we are at that moment. And so in conclusion, I think one of my old supervisors always used to say, be gentle with yourself, and I think this is more than ever important as we're talking about engagement strategies, to work that in. We always laugh when we do engagement. Our last activity is always to go around and talk about naming one thing that we're going to do for ourselves that day. And it's interesting what people will say, whether it's walking the dog or, having a good time, watching a Netflix film, but just to recenter after a conversation on what kind of self-care, what are you going to do at the end of the day after having one of these meetings. So super important. Yes, but I feel like I've talked enough, so thank you so much.
Carolyn, thank you so much, and so much information, and I know, even in preparing for this webinar, the three of us had pretty in-depth conversations that could have gone on a really long time, so I know that we have a lot to absorb on this, and it is a big topic. But you've done an absolutely wonderful job of providing that sort of food for thought and getting the discussion going. And so I'm going to go now. There have been some chats and some questions in the chat box. So if it's okay, I'm going to work my way sort of up and through them. And Allison, please, don't hesitate to hop in and share your thoughts as well on some of these questions. So some of them are comments and some of them are questions, and I just want to make sure we touch on as many as we can before we move into a broader discussion around the questions that we were going to talk about. From Carolyn Canfield, we were talking about how to better engage with patients for system improvement. However, physicians regularly meet with traumatized patients. They can re-traumatize harmed patients. How can we ensure health professional education includes intensive trauma-informed care?
That's a really, really good point. And yes, I wish that it did integrate trauma-informed care a lot more. And I know sometimes we engage with health researchers who are also clinicians, and we have these long conversations because I'll keep kind of pushing the safety talk into our meeting minutes, and they just want to get to the, let's just do the engagement, and why do we have to have these conversations? But I think it's so important to have the recognition that these are really important conversations that need to be addressed and that need to be acknowledged. And even if you think that, that something might not have, this is a light subject and, nobody's going to get, it can happen. It can happen at any type of engagement when people are sharing. So it's better to prepare and be ready for that and to make sure that you really address everyone's need for safety. And sometimes that means advocating a lot to some healthcare professionals or researchers that this is the way that we need to do it and it has to be inclusive. Yeah, and if you are unable, maybe sometimes having someone facilitate from outside the conversation is good as well.
Thank you for that. From Belinda Boyd, Carolyn, thank you for this important information. Do you have any suggestions for an opening statement to use during an engagement session to frame a desire to create safe spaces for people in the space?
That's a good question. I think because a lot of times we open with kind of a more relationship building or a brainstorming session, and then we move on to the safe spaces conversation that we have and build those principles, those guiding principles around. And that can take a few meetings sometimes because people really need to think about what is going to help them with the relationship. And so it's an ongoing dialogue and conversation. I think that has to keep going. More so than a one-time kind of at the very beginning. I think touching base on it every time we get together to ensure that everyone understands and we're speaking the same language around it is important.
Thank you. We have a question. How do we avoid using clients for self-education? For example, asking clients to speak for the community.
Yes. I think that all goes back to the importance of inclusive engagement, and really when you are thinking about engaging people with lived experience, going through questions like who may experience this health issue differently, whether there's say a sex or gender difference, who has different access to care. So thinking about systemic racism, transphobia, and making sure that there is representation, because I know sometimes, and having those creating a space where we can kind of challenge each other too, because I know sometimes there'll be, I've seen events where one patient partner is expected to speak on behalf of all people with lived experience, and that can't be the fact. I know for the intersectional and the trauma-informed stuff, we typically, for the entire team, have a conversation around critical reflexive practice where everyone, including healthcare professionals and patient partners, need to think about their own social location, what that says about larger systems of power and oppression, and how we acknowledge those types of things. So it kind of then makes everyone start thinking about their own context and how that might be different from other people's, and making sure that everyone advocates that we need more people at the table. So it's, we're not having representation from lower socioeconomic status. We're going to have to find a way to engage that group as well and not leave that group out.
Allison, I was wondering if you wanted to comment on that at all. In your experience, have you felt that as a patient partner that you're that expectation?
Sorry, I'm a little bit unclear with your question, Angela.
Just wondering that perspective of speaking for all, being a voice at the table, representative as opposed to your own perspective. Have you had that situation? Do you have recommendations for patient partners who are in that situation?
Yeah, I think this is actually quite a big issue, and I think there's quite a bit of cherry picking that happens, unfortunately. So we do end up representing a lot of other people. And we've been grappling with this too, like even within our own group, like Patients for Patient Safety Canada, it is a fairly homogenous group, and we see certain demographics of people most often in engagement roles that are not representative. So I think we have a lot of work to do here. And I think a lot speaks to, how easy is it, like for me as a white woman with a university degree, and fairly articulate and comfortable navigating through the processes, I'm maybe easier to work with, or that's the perception. So we really, I think, need to break out of these boxes and work at how do we engage all of the people, because yes, we're doing lots of patient engagement, but we're doing a lot of engaging the same patients.
And I think on top of what you're saying, Allison, the whole meeting people where they're at, which means we might use a variety of different participatory approaches, right? Like it's not just meeting around a table and having the typical kind of meeting. If you're engaging youth, you might want to use art-based ways of engaging, or going to community events and having community. I think talking to champions and leaders within community, what is the best way to engage is really important. So instead of saying, I have this set participatory approach that I want to use, going and saying, what is the best way? And so we've had all sorts of ones where we, going to communities and having like a radio show, or having people talk, to be able to phone in and talk to people. So just finding different ways of connecting with people. But it means more work and being more flexible. And
but I also think sometimes we might have to flip this on its head. Like we're looking for who can we engage in what, like we're making those decisions about so how do we get to a point where people, from whatever group can identify what an issue is, and how then do they bring that issue forward and get it to get the attention that they need? Because I think that's I think that's a big missing connection in a lot of this patient engagement work.
Yeah. Thank you. Those are really good observations. And I would throw into the mix around the different ways to engage and how are we learning from in real-time experience and potentially engaging beyond that. But that engagement of hearing about people's experience and identifying ways to improve from it fairly quickly. So I'm going to move us on into our questions and open up the discussion again a little bit more even with our chat box and with all of you. And so if we could advance the slides, thank you so much for the presentation. So our first question that we'd like to pose and hear your thoughts on is, what does physical, psychological, emotional, cultural safety mean to you? What does that look like to you or feel like to you? And if you can put in your chat box your thoughts on that, that would be great. And I wonder, Carolyn, if there are any things in particular that sort of key messages around this that you would like to share at this point as well.
I find whenever we do this exercise, we have very different, because safety is defined kind of differently for different people, and so it's always really interesting to see what people have to say or how they define it, for sure. Yeah. Oh, look at that.
So Kathy has said, building relationships, spending the first meeting, just getting to know who is engaging, especially in Indigenous engagement or trauma-related engagement. Don't underestimate creating a safe space by doing this. Having my concern about not being healthy taken seriously before I'm in emergency room, from Selena. Claire, no judgment. Salima, meeting people where they are at. Bonnie, unbiased, open, willingness to listen. Bob, safety to me means not needing to feel threatened, even by a different opinion. Excellent. Being heard, from Julia. Constant check-ins. Means that I, as a patient, is welcomed to be me. And sometimes my messages are hard, and that is okay. Very interesting. But it's not meant to be against them, but to create ways to make improvements. I think that comment it was really about that that sort of self-awareness piece, right? About why am I hearing the story, and what am I going to do with it, and being comfortable with, not being comfortable. And so I think all of that, really, really great comments here. Angela brought up real-time learning. Wouldn't it be marvelous to prevent the trauma? That means healthcare that is trauma-informed to anticipate trauma. Yeah, it's that two pieces, Carolyn, where we have the direct care and the trauma-informed care in the actual care, and then the piece around the engagement piece. And it would be wonderful not to be seeing that happening, for sure. A safe space for me, from Amy, a safe space for me to receive care where there are BIPOC acronym. I'm not sure. I might need you to spell that out for me, Amy. In all levels of an organization, not just the janitors and PSWs, knowing that there will be an ASL interpreter provided for me if I am deaf, knowing there is height adjustable examination table if I am a wheelchair user. Excellent. That accessibility piece for involvement is so important.
And I think for the acronym, Black, Indigenous people, and people of color.
Thank you. My headspace was somewhere totally different. So we have a lot of comments here. This is so great. And just and thank you, Amy, for spelling it out for me, too. So we have a lot of comments here, and I'll just remind everybody that we are capturing all of these, and these will all be shared. And So I'm going to move us just to the next question, and then we can, for a little bit more discussion. So what does it mean to you to be comfortable versus unsafe? Why is this an important distinction? And what does this mean from our work in trauma-informed engagement? I think that's really interesting. We see this a lot around, and I think, Allison, you talked about sort of that control piece, controlling the message, controlling the conversation, controlling where the engagement happens, how it happens, when it happens, and creating it to be comfortable, potentially, for everyone involved. But what does it mean to be uncomfortable versus unsafe?
I loved that Carol brought up in the chat box, and you've mentioned it as well, Angela, this idea about getting comfortable being uncomfortable. And I like to think of that space of being uncomfortable as a place where we grow, and that's, I know, how I've kind of did a lot of this. So when I look at this question, I think about, safety as a place where I don't have to worry about being exploited. I think that's for me personally, that's a big thing. But I think that being uncomfortable is important if we're going to grow. And I like that whole no mud, no lotus, right? Like that's another one of my little sayings, no mud, no lotus. Got to get dirty, got to come undone, Part of it.
Carolyn, do you want to comment on this one?
Oh, yeah, I totally agree with Allison around that piece. And with vulnerability comes that kind of, there's going to be times where we're uncomfortable all around, and that's not a bad thing, especially too, even renegotiating power imbalances. So say if a healthcare professional is trying to throw around their expertise and partners are not feeling that they're being heard, understanding that it's okay to point that out and to have that uncomfortable conversation to break through and figure out, okay, wait a minute, how can we better, make decisions because people aren't being heard. So I think it always brings on growth. I think some of the biggest challenges that have happened in engagement typically are the ones that we learn from. And even the Valuing All Voices framework comes from a time where there was some uncomfortable conversations around lack of understanding around trauma and voices traditionally less heard being engaged in the process, and so that's where it all came from.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, it's interesting, like I'm looking at some of the comments here, and I think that things like, for example, when Selena's comment about having my concern about not being healthy taken seriously before I'm in the emergency room, that whole idea of being heard. She also mentions having a way to identify my correct gender and name on official records so I do not have to correct the team every time there's a changeover of staff while staying in the hospital, are potentially happening on the front line in direct care. But when we look at the priorities within about what we should be addressing and what are the ways that we could be improving, it's those very experiences that can really direct what we're going to be working on. And so I think it's really, that piece around having conversations about things that people are just not sure how to deal with sometimes, or they don't know what they're going to do about it, can be really challenging in engagement. For Amy Ma, a safe space for me to receive care. Did I already read this one? I think I've already read that one. Uncomfortable space where learning takes place. I am discovering and questioning my implicit bias and privilege. Yeah, we haven't really talked about that implicit bias piece, and I think when we look at those conversations in engagement, I don't know about you guys, but have you ever been at a table where a patient partner maybe brings something up that they think is a priority and others at the table just don't see it as a priority or don't see it as a problem, probably because they're coming from a very different place. Allison or Carolyn, do you want to jump in on that at all? On the implicit bias piece?
Did you want to, I know that's, yeah, that is a big one, and I think some of the importance around doing some critical reflexive exercises at the very beginning, and I know it's, whenever I talk to researcher and clinician researchers, it can be really uncomfortable because I think within health research, there's this idea that you're objective and that you don't bring these types of things. And so breaking down and having healthcare professionals and researchers do some critical reflexive practice, have an understanding of the social locations in which they inhabit and how they're associated with unearned privilege is really important, and how it might affect the way that they're viewing a problem or looking at a situation, so that then as a group that you can actually call someone out and it's not going to be, there's going to be that understanding even amongst healthcare researchers that yes, they do have privilege and bias there.
Yeah, Eileen says uncomfortable means not being respected as being on the same level or platform with the healthcare team members, and you'll see that in the language being used in meetings and sort of assumptions made about levels of understanding. Carolyn, uncomfortable arises from reflection, internal. Unsafe risks further injury, expanding the harm. Excellent point, Carolyn. Kate, uncomfortable is when you feel you're being challenged to think, act, and feel slightly outside of your comfort zone. Unsafe is when you are repeatedly triggered or have a negative reaction to someone or a group who continually disrespect your views despite your requests. Thank you for sharing that, Kate. I think, that makes me think, Allison, of your comment at the beginning when you were talking about how advisors are getting and patient partners are, a lot of them are getting burnt out. And it's that piece and that frustration if they feel like they are sharing and using their perspective and experience to inform, but you don't see anything change. And I've seen that with some of our patient partners who will, spend a lot of time and energy on some things and then have a hospital experience that isn't a great one and think, why am I even doing this? And so, that I think that's a really interesting point about that sort of sense of disrespect of your views, and what does that look like? Like, what does disrespect look like for a patient partner? Linda. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Allison.
I was just going to say, what I really noticed within, the group of patient partners is this, when we get a bunch of patient partners together and we want to talk, it's so interesting to see how much space is needed to give voice. And I know that that's really something that I've recognized is that, and I think that speaks as well to when we're at a table and we do have all of these competing issues that we'd like to bring forward, is that we really are, there's so many of us who are so frustrated with trying to have our voices heard in this space. So this is another reason why I think this trauma-informed piece is so important, is because really that space, we haven't been given that space probably adequately. So I see it, playing out even within the discussions between patient partners.
Yeah, and I think, when I think about new and emerging ways to engage, one of the things that I think is, we have a couple things that we're doing right now that I think are kind of interesting. One of them is as you hear things that maybe come through patient relations, that's one way of finding out that there's an issue. But so often, that's not how people don't always go to patient relations. And the places where we could be, as Carolyn mentioned earlier, like preventing the trauma in the first place, come from, conversations that people are having between each other about their experience. And so, like, how are we creating times and opportunities for that to happen? And when are staff able even to bring things like that forward, and in what way? Are there mechanisms for the sharing of what patients and families are saying in the moment is happening in their experience? And being open and willing to hear things that are not always positive, for sure. And so I think, I really do think that we need to be creating those spaces in different ways, and providing vehicles in different ways that are safe for people to have those conversations. Belinda mentions as well, you can talk through discomfort and learn from it. In being unsafe, your voice is silenced. Bob says, uncomfortable, you have questions about your environment. It's unsafe, you are aware you have a very threatening question arising in your environment. Maybe it's a matter of degree. Carolyn, what do you think? Do you think it's a matter of degree?
Yeah, I think definitely it could be seen as a matter of degree, and that's why, I think it is important to have those conversations out front around how we define it amongst us as a group, and how each of us individually define it, so that we can address those things. Because sometimes, because of past experiences, there are things that other people might not think could be triggering, and so having that open dialogue around what that might be is really important.
Amy has commented that the road to trauma-informed care and decolonizing healthcare in general requires cultural humility, an ongoing process to remain curious to learn. Great point. Kate, bias, social location, privilege, cultural and competency, sensitivity, and safety should be mandatory training for everyone, and especially those in healthcare and community service. Couldn't agree more, and engaging patients and families in that training and in that education, I think is going to be really important. So we're running out of time. I'm cognizant we've only got a couple minutes left. So very, very quickly, first of all, Carolyn, I just want to say I really, really loved the idea, the very simplicity of the things that we learn can be shared, but the stories that are shared are ours to own. And I think that is just so clear, and I loved that point. So thank you so much for your presentation and working through everything with us. It was really informative and just the tip of the iceberg. And Allison, thank you so much, not just for co-hosting the webinar and helping to facilitate with me, but also sharing some really valuable insights. And it's been a pleasure to have these conversations with you leading up to this, and I look forward to us having the opportunity to have more of these conversations. And I'd also like to do a quick shout out as well to the great CFHI webinar production team for today, Kelly and Isabel and Karine and Sheena for their for translation, and to Haley for pulling all the pieces together and helping to monitor the chat box and so forth. And thank you all for your insights and thoughtful commentary and ideas. Your feedback is invaluable to us for future webinar design. So we ask that you please just take a moment now to provide us some feedback on today's session. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks to you all, and I look forward to reading the chat box in the archive. Bye-bye.